All right, it's good to have everybody here tonight. Tonight we want to talk about uh, the role our labor communicators play in recording history. Through time, our communicators not only communicate to our membership, they record the times that they're living in. And these are interesting times from the standpoint that a lot of things are happening that need to be recorded and prepared for the history. Now, I recently read a book on Red Cloud, the great Sioux war chief. And in the book, there was a quote that said, "Memory is like riding a horse at night with a lighted torch. The torch casts its light only so far, and beyond that's darkness." Our memory is like that. We only remember things for so long. So we have to record the things that's happening for future generations. And like I said, we're living in a time when there's a lot of things happening. Our truth is under attack every day. There are those who are trying to rewrite our history, those who are trying to change the narrative in the time in which we live in, from the news to museums. Right now we're trying to remove things about slavery in museums, but removing the exhibits does not change the fact that it happened. So those of us who are living through this time have a responsibility to document these times, and so in the future, when historians research this time, there's other methods of research other than the things that might be in the press. The wealthy has tried to control the media for a long time. As a matter of fact, currently, Jeff Bezos, who the founder of Amazon, owns the Washington Post, he owns Prime Video, he owns Amazon MGM Studios. And then you got News Corp, which is controlled by the Murdoch family. They own Fox News, Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and of course, Elon Musk owns X, formerly known as Twitter. And these people have the opportunity to slant the way the news is presented. Nine of the 10 richest men in America own a media outlet. From 2022 to 2024, over 8,300 newsroom professionals were fired and replaced with people who would slant the news in the direction those 9 of the 10 richest men wanted. Look at Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, taking off the air just for joking. So telling the truth is more important now than it's ever been before. Howard Zinn was considered the leading authority on American history in his life. And Zinn stated his approach to research was something he called history from below, emphasizing the idea of primary documents to capture the experiences of ordinary people rather than focusing on only the historical versions. For example, in Zinn's great book, People's History of the United States, he has a chapter on Christopher Columbus, and he says that people ask him, well, where did you find all that stuff about Columbus? All the dastardly things he done. And Zinn said that he found it in Columbus's own diaries. That's the things he recorded about himself. So we only can get true history when things are from first-hand accounts, first-person accounts. Now, and that's what a primary document is. It's something that's written by a person who witnessed it, either through participation or from afar, but it's somebody who saw the things that was happening. Our local union communication is primary documents. Every newsletter you produce, every website post, every social media post, it's a record of what's going on right now in the world. So artists have always recorded the events of time, and the wealthy and powerful have tried to whitewash those events. But the record that artists do is important for the rest of us. So let's take a look at 4 of them tonight, and we're going to look at them through a historical timeline. Let's begin with 1890 to 1920. In 1900, there was about 2 million children working in factories across the United States. These were typically poor children. They worked in very hazardous conditions for very low wages. Social reformers and labor unions worked to end the practice of child labor in this country. One of the people that we're going to talk about tonight was instrumental in that. His name's Lewis Hine. He was a photographer for the National Child Labor Committee, and he used his images to put the shame of child labor on the pages of newspapers across the country. Now, Hines started out as a school teacher in New York City, and he kept noticing he was losing all of these students, and he was losing them because they were going to work. So he became involved with the National Child Labor Committee and left his teaching position, traveling the country, making photographs of children in the workplace. And he did it to get them published in papers so the public could see this. A lot of times when bad things are happening, you're not going to see it on the front page. And unless people look at what's happening, say like with the ICE raids and things today, it's easy to forget about it. Here's some of the images Lewis Hine collected of children working in the workplaces. He would go to these factories and tell them he was from an industrial magazine, and they'd let him in, and he pretended he would take pictures of the plants, but what he was actually doing is taking pictures of children. This is significant because right now all across the country, states are trying to roll back child labor laws. It's happening in Florida and Kentucky and Arkansas and Tennessee, particularly to the South. They want the laws that's protected children from the workplace repealed, so they can put kids to work in situations. All right, here's a quote from Lewis Hine. It said, "There's work that profits children, and there's work that profit only to employers. The object of employing children is not to train them, but to get high profits from their work." I want you to notice one thing. You see, a little girl is barefooted, working in an industrial setting. Here, this is a sock mill in Fort Payne, Alabama. See, the children are barefooted because they literally have to crawl on top of the machines when the string breaks to re-thread them. Children at this time, it was common for them to have missing toes and fingers. But this is a scourge on our society, when we place children in situations like this. Here's another quote from Lewis. "Photography can light up darkness and expose ignorance." Here we see a child picking cotton in the South. When I was about 4, I started joining my mother picking cotton. You started in a flour sack, and then you went from a tote sack, and from that to a pick sack. And so, but it was commonplace. We used to get out of school about 3 weeks in October for the children to pick cotton. All right, here's children going down in a coal mine to work. This is a photograph of Newsies, the children that used to sell newspapers in the big cities. And in those days, most of the big cities papers had 2 editions, a morning and an evening edition. So these small children would stand out on street corners and sell newspapers in the morning, and then go back in the evening to sell the evening edition. Photography is an empathy towards the world. Lewis Hine. Of course, the word empathy has been in the news lately. There was a person we had canonized who said that empathy was a bad thing. The young man in this photograph has a job. You see, he's got a whip around his neck. They used to use ponies to pull carts in and out of coal mines to bring the coal in and out. And his job was to lead the ponies to pull the carts that ran on the rails. If I could tell the story in words, I wouldn't need to lug a camera around. Lewis Hine said this. This is one of his more haunting images. I used to show this to 3rd graders when I was teaching school. And I would ask them what they think the little girl sees out the window. And they would say, children play in the playground. I don't know what the little girl sees out the window, but it's better than what she sees in there. All right, let's move on to the Great Depression. There was a lot of things that caused the Great Depression. Stock market crash was one thing. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, which collapsed world trade, food tariffs being placed back and forth. And when we talk about the stock market crash, one of the things that led to that was the Dust Bowl. The stock market in those days was based heavily on agricultural futures. And when the Dust Bowl occurred, all these farms in the Midwest fell because they had overworked the land to turn to dust, and windstorms come through and literally blew the topsoil away. And all this contributed to the Depression. When Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, he said, "I pledge to you, I pledge to myself a new deal for the American people." And the New Deal included lots of legislation to put people back to work. Like the WPA built parks across the country. Then we had the Farm Security Administration. In 1937, the Farm Security Administration decided to fund a photography project to document the life of the people impacted by the Depression. One of the people that hired was a hero of mine. Her name was Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange was born in New Jersey, and she had the chance to learn photography from Clarence White, a famous photographer from the time. She moved to San Francisco and started a portrait business and was very successful. But when the Depression hit, her business, like the rest of them, went out of business, and she picked up money shooting photographs of people living on the street in San Francisco. Her work caught the attention of the Farm Security Administration, and she was hired to document the struggles of the people trying to live through depression. This is a quote from her. It says, "I'm trying here to say something about the despised, the defeated, and the alienated, about death and disaster, about the wounded, the crippled, the helpless, the rootless, the dislocated, about finality, about the last ditch." The people that she was photographing knew about the last ditch because that's where they found themselves. About the time all of this happened, about 2 million people in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado were sharecroppers, and they found themselves without any way to make a living. The topsoil blew away, and the people who owned the farms told them they had to go because there would not be any work for them for years. So the people had to load up their families, drive to California looking for work. But you got to remember, there were already people in California doing the work, right? Here's another quote from Dorothea Lange. "While there's perhaps a province in which the photograph can tell us nothing more than what we see with our own eyes, there's another in which it proves us how little our eyes permit us to see. This photograph's called Dead, Stalled, and Stranded. Can you imagine having your whole family in this truck and you're trying to get to California and you break down?" This photograph here is from March 1937. It's called Stalled in Southern California Desert. No money, 10 children, from Chickasaw, Oklahoma. The most famous photograph in this period is one called The Migrant Mother, the photograph pictured here. Dorothea Lange won a Pulitzer Prize for this photograph. And she said, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. Years later, when the photograph became famous, the children came forward and said, 'That's our mother.'" Here's a photograph of them living in a tent. They're living in a field in California in the wintertime, and they were living off the vegetables that had been left in the field and birds that the children could kill. But Dorothea Lange traveled all across, particularly the western part of the United States, taking photographs of these people who are living in these very desperate times. During World War II, she also took on a project of shooting the Asian American concentration camps we set up in this country. And then in the 1950s, she went to Ireland to document the struggle of the Irish for independence from England. All right, we moved from the Depression to the Great War. In the late 30s, wars raging in Europe. The United States is reluctant to enter the war. American hero Charles Lindbergh was against the United States entering the war. After Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped, his family moved to Europe. And while he was there to see the buildup of the German military. And he came back to the United States and became involved with the America First movement. See, this America First we're hearing now, that's not something new. That's been around for a while. So Lindbergh went across the country giving speeches against Roosevelt because Roosevelt felt we should support the Allies. And Lindbergh kept saying, we can't beat Germany, so it's better not to become involved. But the biggest reason all these people didn't want to become involved is there were 250 American businesses that held $450 million of German assets. They were making money off Hitler and the Nazis. In 1939, a Youth for Hitler rally was held at Madison Square Garden. Here's a newspaper headline about that. So artists again had to try to come out and tell the truth. Political cartoonist from the time named Theodore Geisel became kind of famous for doing that. He worked in the 1930s and 40s, and he won several awards, including a Pulitzer Prize for his work. Now, he tried to tell the story why we needed to join the war effort, and he tried to expose the America First movement is simply nothing but a fascist movement in the United States. Here's some of his cartoons. In this cartoon, you see a German submarine, and it said, "Don't waste a torpedo, Fritz. We can take this game with the butterfly net." And it's the USS Disunity. It's from all the people who were trying to keep the United States out of the war for the rich people who are profiting off of it. Here's another one where it says U.S. Nazis are saying, "Come on, Sam, let's try the Great German manicure," which is anti-Semitism. They're chopping hands off. So Theodore Geisel, he went straight to the jugular on his political cartoons. Here's one, Pledge of Allegiance. "We give our heads, and our hearts to God and our country, one language, but 2 flags." You see here politics is more important than the United States. In this cartoon, it says, put your finger here, pal. We got Hitler wrapping up race and hatred. It says, my annual gift to civilization. Has anybody been doing that lately? What about hatred? Do you hear that? See, the thing about these cartoons is a lot of them could be used right now. They'd fit right in. Here's one of Dr. Seuss's cartoons on Lindbergh. Here goes Lindbergh flying through the air, and it says, it's smart to shop at Adolph's. All victories guaranteed, referring back to Lindbergh's speeches saying that we need to stay out of the war because we couldn't beat Germany anyway. This shows the Lindbergh Quarter, the United States of America. You see the bird with his head in the sand. Here's one says Lindbergh for president, 1944. Keep your eye on the bum that's tagging along behind, which is just the U.S. fascists. Let's say the fascists was using Lindbergh for their message. All right, here's one on America First. It says the coach for America First is telling the United States, remember, no punting, no passing, no plunging. Just dig in on your 1-inch line and win. In other words, let's sit back and let Hitler do what Hitler's going to do. So see, America First is not a new slogan. That's a revived slogan. Here's another one, America First, that's reading to children about Adolf the Wolf. And the wolf chewed up the children to spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. This one here shows the Nazi train coming down the track. It says, relax, Sam. I assure you the express turns off right here. America First and Appeasement Junction. Again, trying to run interference to keep us out of World War II. Of course, Roosevelt, being a man of the people, had a lot of detractors. And this one just shows how the rich are using the uninformed to go against Roosevelt. This one right here says, fellow experimenters, we're gathered here today to make the eagle and the jellyfish. And see, that's Lindbergh. Yeah. Lindbergh, to us, he's known as like a big hero. But when you know the man, is not quite so same. Here is the GOP ostrich, he called it, the offspring of the GOP and the isolation ostrich, stopping all U.S. progress. You know, we are part of the world, and the things that happen in the world matter to us. This one here shows a little guy walking up here to the House Ways and Means Committee, and he's saying, you got to go back over here to the turnstile and pay for your income tax, while the rich and the wealthy are going through the loopholes. We still see that today. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the war effort became big business for the same people who'd been making money off the Nazis. But they tried to cause confusion and dissension here. They did not want minorities to be able to hire in these wartime industries. And this is a cartoon Dr. Seuss did showing, about trying to keep minorities out of those jobs, because most of those are pretty good jobs. Here's another one along those same line. Uncle Sam is tapping on the war industry's shoulder, saying, listen, Maestro, if you want to get real harmony, use the black keys as well as the white. Because, like I said, there again, they try to keep minorities out of these jobs. Here's one, ho hum. When he's finished packing down the last tree, he'll likely be tired. And this goes back to the America First movement. You can see this is the United States birds in a tree, and here's the Nazi bird up here trying to chop down England. He's already got Poland, France, Holland, Norway, Greece, but it goes back to the America First stuff. Here's another one about America First. It's a kangaroo, and it says, relatives nigh. They're just three fellas going along a ride. So say the America First is carrying the Nazis, the fascists, and the communists. Now, you may not recognize the name Theodor Geisel, but you probably recognize the name he was known better as, Dr. Seuss. And if you look at Dr. Seuss' books, the characters in his cartoons are very similar to the ones you found in the books. So Dr. Seuss very much was a progressive person and a progressive thinker, and spent a lot of time trying to educate people. So after World War II, the troops start coming home. And they come home after having fought the fascists to preserve democracy for the world. But not all the troops are treated equally when they come home. Racism in the country became worse. The United States had always been a country that seemed to be divided by race. But during the war, the races were put together. And then as they come home, everybody expected them to be together again, but that wasn't the case. And leaders such as Dr. King and Malcolm X stepped forward to try to bring shine a light on discrimination that was taking place. And a lot of these artists turned their attention to civil rights themes. Norman Rockwell was an unlikely hero who stepped forward to support civil rights. Norman Rockwell was hired as an illustrator for Boy's Life magazine at 19. In 39, he moved to Vermont and started painting small town America. And he got hired by the Saturday Evening Post, was a magazine at the time that was very popular among middle class white people. And for 50 years, he painted for them. By the early 60s, Norman Rockwell really wanted to turn his attention toward more progressive themes. Now, for one thing, his first wife passed away, and his second wife was a very progressive thinker. And she had a big impact on him exploring the themes that he felt were necessary. So he left the Saturday Evening Post and went to work for Look magazine. But the Saturday Evening Post was very popular. My grandfather worked a cattle farm for this rich guy. The cattle farm was just like a hobby. And I can remember as a child, the rich family would give my grandparents stuff that they were like, and I remember seeing the Saturday Evening Post at their house. And over the Rockwell's 50-year career with them, he painted about 300 covers of the magazine. It started out coming out twice a month, and then it became more infrequent as time went along. All right, here's an example, And one thing about Rockwell's paintings, they're always full of clues to tell a story. You can see up here in the corner, it says principal. So we know this little girl's in trouble. She's seeing the principal, and she's been in a fight, but she's happy she won the fight. Here's a group of children around the mailman in the wintertime. This painting right here is a clerk at Macy's department store the week before Christmas. We can see the Christmas wrapping paper on the floor, the Christmas tags, and she's frazzled. There's one thing you notice, there's no diversity in these paintings. Because remember, these paintings were done for hire. Here's a basketball game. The game's over. The home team lost. The cheerleader's upset. Here we see a young man about to get a shot in the doctor's office, and he's reading the doctor's diploma on the wall. Now, Rockwell did one of the very first Rosie the Riveter images. This is from 1943, and this one did appear in the Saturday Evening Post. But this was one of the first time there was a song about Rosie the Riveter, and Rockwell did this painting. We see this lady who's on her lunch break. She's got a rivet gun in her hand, and if you look down at her foot is on a copy of Hitler's manifesto. So she's helping put down the Nazis with her work. But Rockwell continued painting on as the war ended. Here we see soldiers coming home. Here we see a young man that's going off to college. Again, he gives us clues. It's got the college pendant on the side of his luggage. It's got his books from college. It's got his father who's sending him off on the train to college. So Rockwell was a great storyteller through his paintings. Rockwell was very inspired by Franklin Roosevelt, and he did a series of 4 paintings he called the 4 Freedoms, and he offered them to the War Department to use to sell war bonds, but the War Department decided that was not what they wanted. So the 4 paintings he did ended up in Saturday Evening Post magazine covers, and the 4 paintings were called Freedom from Want, Freedom of Worship, Freedom of Fear, and Freedom of Speech. Right. The freedom of speech is my favorite one. So let's take a look at this painting and see what's going on here. Today, we've got internet, we've got message boards, we've got email. We all know what's happening. Back in the 40s, early 50s, there was no way for people to know what was happening. So they would have town meetings. And people would come in, they'd give them a report, and they would go over the things that was happening in the town. And this painting here, our main character, is standing up speaking. When we look at him, and let's see, for some reason. All right, here we go. All right. So our main character standing up speaking. He's got on a jacket that's kind of dirty. He's got on his flannel shirt. When you contrast that with the people sitting around him. All right, so another thing that Rockwell does, he shows us the guy's hands. See, We see down here the speaker's hands are working hands. They're dirty, they're rough, they're calloused, and he purposely shows us the hands of the people sitting around him. Clean hands who've not worked. The last detail that he gives us is the town report. See the guy in the lower here, it says town report, and the other guy in the suit shows him holding his. But the person who's speaking, his report is in his pocket. A person who works every day doesn't need a report to know how things are. That's like now the president can stand up and tell the United Nations that here wages are up, prices are down, and employment's down. But we know different. We live this. We go to the grocery store. We know prices are not down. We see the numbers. Unemployment is up, you know. So here Rockwell is showing us the real important person at this town hall is not the guys in the suits. It's the guy who works every day, the average guy who builds the country and makes things go. This one is called Freedom of Worship. And it's the first time that the Evening Post included diversity in one of their paintings. Now, if we look at this painting, like I said, we see more than just Caucasian people. And at the top of it, it said, now remember the name is Freedom of Worship. It says, each according to the dictates of his own conscience, you know, which is essentially saying, hey, everybody's religion is important. So Rockwell is beginning to include these themes in a magazine that doesn't necessarily want them. So in the early 1960s, he switched to Look magazine. Look was a more progressive magazine at the time, and they looked at more serious issues such as civil rights. All right, this is from 1967. It's called Moving Day. It shows the integration of Chicago's Park Forest suburb. You know, it's new families moving in. Here's the new family. We've got the neighborhood kids, and you know, eventually they're going to become friends. And you may not could see it, but up the street here, there's people looking out the window. The older people are not going to be happy, and you know, children are not born being prejudiced. Children are taught to be prejudiced. This is called Murder in Mississippi. It's from the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, that had gone down there to register people to vote. They were murdered and buried and earthen down. This one's called The Problem We All Live With. I've also seen it called The Stain We All Live With. This was published in 1964, and it's one of Rockwell's most famous civil rights images. It depicts 6-year-old Ruby Bridges being escorted to an all-white school by U.S. Marshals, and we see the graffiti on the wall, and they're throwing vegetables. Now, Ruby Bridges, I believe I read, turned 60 this year, or 70 this year. She turned 70 years old this year. So this has not been that long ago. You know, there were a lot of lives given to win freedom for all in this country. And every day we're seeing those freedoms eroded, you know, by the same type of people who tried to keep them off all those years ago. This painting is called The Right to Know, and it's talking about the public's frustration with the U.S. government over their lack of transparency for the Vietnam War. And again, if you think back on those Saturday Evening Post paintings Rockwell did, there's no diversity. In this painting, there's lots of diversity. Here's a painting of the citizens of the United States. And for Rockwell shows different races, different cultures, different genders, because that's what America is a melting pot of all people together. Now, one of the last paintings he did for the Saturday Evening Post is a very popular one, and it ended up being in a lot of magazines. And this one's called Do Unto Others as You Would Have Them Do Unto You. As we look at this painting, we see this Bible verse that most people are familiar with. But what Rockwell is saying here, you have to do unto others who look different from you, who think different from you, who worship different from you, whose culture is different from yours. You know, if we can't do unto all others, then we're not doing to anyone. So Norman Rockwell stepped out of his place and as a very safe artist to take up themes to try to make a difference in the world. So Lewis Hine, Dorothea Lange, Dr. Seuss or Theodore Geisel, Norman Rockwell all used their art to try to make a difference. I want our local union communicators to understand every day you're out there making a difference. These times that we're living in, it's up to you to document these times through your words, through your images, through the things you put out. So as our history is being whitewashed, so to speak, there's going to be a firsthand account, those primary documents that historians in the future can use. You might be the next Lewis Hines, or Dorothea Lange, or Theodore Geisel, or Norman Rockwell. Dorothea Lange was not a wealthy person. She was a person who did what she could. Lewis Hines died in a poor house. He died, but he was rich in the legacy that he left. Dr. Seuss was a successful children's author, and Norman Rockwell was a successful painter, but they both done the things they could to try to make a difference in the world. I want to encourage you to attend events, record what's happening, share your work with the Reuther Library at Wayne State to be archived there. In November, we're going to have the archivist from the Reuther Library to do a presentation. He's going to show you how to send him your stuff so they can archive it. Because, like I said, in the future, these historians are not going to rely solely on the mainstream media. They're going to look at personal, firsthand accounts. Your local union publications are primary documents, and it's up to you to record the true history of the times that we're living in. So, with that, I appreciate your time.